Hello, this is Dr. Richard Siegel, and welcome to an introduction to metaphor therapy. To begin, let's start off with a few definitions of terms, beginning with what is a metaphor. Metaphors are a figure of speech in which meaning is carried across from one meaning to another. I could say, I'm so hurt that my heart is broken, and we know my heart isn't physically broken, but it's an expression, a figure of speech to indicate one thing using a representation of another. The second definition we'll look at is the definition of the subconscious mind. And many people wonder just what is the subconscious, because viewed as a dark, unknowable force. And actually, the subconscious mind, interestingly enough, only consists of one thing and one thing only: pictures. Pictures are the fabric of the subconscious mind. The subconscious is something you're not aware of. You're not aware of subconscious activity because it's just below conscious awareness at all times, and yet it's active at all times as well. In the metaphorical approach, we want to capture the images that occur just below conscious awareness. Images that you could say represent your feelings, but in actuality they fuel your feelings, because the images resident within the subconscious mind are viewed by the subconscious as real. When you sleep at night and you see a dream, and within the dream you're looking at a table, that table is as rock solid in your dream as it is as if it were actually in front of you while you're awake, because the subconscious sees everything that it contains. It sees all the imagery that's within itself as real. And so the key to activating the subconscious mind and gaining access to it is to treat the images that we see as real. More on that later. What are the lost parts of self? The lost parts of self are the parts of self that disconnected during moments of dissociation because of trauma, abuse, great neglect, or loss. More on that later. Another concept we'll explore is how the left brain and the right brain work together. The left brain operates in logical, linear thought, and the right brain is visual and creative. And while we could debate about the different parts of the brain that contain the subconscious mind, for simplicity's sake, we'll just say that the right brain is where the subconscious information is stored. The right brain is comprised of subconscious imagery that we will call storage information forms. And these storage information forms are compressed forms. In other words, the history of a lifetime is contained within the right brain. And it's such a great deal of information, it's such a vast amount of information that to store it, it gets compressed. Much like a computer will compress a file into a zip file to contain the same amount of information with less storage space, so too our history gets compressed into storage information forms that we call metaphors. And these metaphors or metaphorical constructs contain the history of a lifetime. And an example is a history of abuse that gets compressed into a storage information form of a volcano. Once a volcano's energy is discharged, the reactions that unconsciously emanate from it will automatically cool down. Unconsciously emanating because we're not aware that we're being triggered by something internally. We often think it's our situation or circumstance. What we do within metaphor therapy is we trace persistent uncomfortable feelings to their point of origin. And we often find moments of abuse, trauma, loss, neglect, or abandonment. Sometimes uncomfortable moments were born in what looked to be impending imminent death. In effect, the subconscious mind freezes just before an awful moment of time rather than go through it. While you might not consciously say, gee, this is the worst moment of my life, I think I'll stop time, I'll freeze time about here to avoid the next awful moment, that's exactly what the subconscious mind does. That's why someone who was involved in a car accident a year ago still sees the car coming at them, because a part of self didn't live through it and is still frozen in that moment of time. And so in effect, they keep seeing it like it happened yesterday because the part of self is still frozen there. In an effort to stop time and escape the next horrible moment, the self disconnects from the psyche, from itself, and this causes a multitude of uncomfortable feelings that can fuel depression, anxiety, phobias, compulsions, and other unwanted behaviors that will use to manage the uncomfortable feelings emanating from this disconnection. For example, when a client thought he was going to die during a flight, when the plane started to take a nosedive, he froze in that second. Believing he'd be dead within the next few minutes, he froze in time. And while sitting in front of me, telling me how much he loved all his grandchildren and didn't have the patience for any of them anymore, when I asked him if he lived through that plane ride, he answered, "Not really." Most people would say, "Certainly, I'm sitting here talking to you. How can you ask me that?" But he said, "Not really," because a part of himself was still stuck, still frozen in the past within that moment before he thought he was going to die. In effect, the part of self actually didn't know he had lived through it. There's a model for this. It's called a T model. A T minus 1 is the moment before T, but the moment before trauma. T plus 1 is the moment after trauma. And in metaphor therapy, we're looking for the parts of self that didn't make it through T in T minus 1 to move it past T into T plus 1, which is the moment after. And the state of mind that generates a history or a lifetime of uncomfortable feelings come from the parts of self that are still fragmented, still frozen in T minus 1. So what we want to do is find the moments of time where dissociation occurred because of trauma, abuse, neglect, loss, abandonment, or fear of death. And we can do that because the uncomfortable feelings that people bring into therapy will lead us. We can trace those feelings back to the moments they were born by using their metaphorical forms. We may not remember the memory, we may not remember the exact moment, but the mind does. We want to find the moments of time that were so overwhelming the psyche shut down and disconnected from itself. This is a defense mechanism. It's called dissociation. It's probably the most common defense mechanism we use, and it can cause a lifetime of uncomfortable feelings that persist, and they emanate from that moment when we shut down and cause the psyche to disconnect. Now, it's not that we shut down. The psyche shut itself down. It wasn't something that we were consciously aware of or in control of. Unfortunately, during the process of dissociation, the parts of self that disconnected become stuck in the past, and this disconnection within the self forms a hole in the soul, and that hole in the soul limits a person's emotional availability and their emotional responsiveness. Since dissociation is not a function of the conscious mind, but an undertaking of the subconscious mind, to recover these lost parts of self and make the person whole again, we want to restore the psyche, we want to restore the self, we want to resolve the split in the psyche on the level it occurred. Within the level it occurred, the subconscious mind. Speaking the metaphorical language of the subconscious, we can find the disconnected parts, the dissociated parts of self, reinstate them, restore them back into the psyche, whereupon the qualities and abilities that have been long thought by the individual to be lost or missing can come back online. And when the lost parts of self come back and are reintegrated, again, the persistent, uncomfortable feelings dissolve or diminish. So, in effect, when holes in the souls are filled with the parts of the self that previously split, the person feels more whole and more content and more easily or has a greater ability to be satisfied. To understand how the mind uses metaphors to operate and store information, let's use a computer analogy. Computers do not speak English or Spanish. They hold English or Spanish or any language and will communicate with the computer in our language. But the machine does not operate on human language. It operates on its own language, its own operational machine language, which is binary. Binary is the language, the operational machine language of computers. Just as binary is the operational machine language of a computer, metaphorical pictures are the operational machine language of the mind. And these metaphors, these storage information forms, these internal structures are the source of our thoughts and our feelings and consequently our reactions. Going back to our understanding of the left and right brain operations, the left brain is logical and linear, right brain visual and creative. How does one communicate with the other? You'll notice when you ask someone a question, their eyes go left, right, up, down, different directions, because what's going on is that the left logical brain is going to the right visual brain, where the history of a lifetime is stored, sees an answer very quickly, and then comes back to the left brain for logical answer. So logical question is asked, left accesses right visual, comes back with a logical answer. The question is, how long does it take the left logical brain to view the right visual brain and then provide a left brain logical answer or reaction? About 1/10 of a second. It all takes about 1/10 of a second, which is why this is an unconscious process. You're not aware of it because of how quickly it happens. The questions and the way they're asked capture the images that the left brain usually only sees for a fraction of a second. And because the information comes to us so quickly, we're not aware of what we've seen, but we're very aware of how we feel when we see it. For example, you and a friend are walking down the street, you see a big dog, it comes up to you, you go to pet it, your friend backs off. Both of your reactions are instantaneous. Only takes a second to react, and only a fraction of a second for you to know if you feel safe or not. So why did you and your friend have completely different reactions to the same dog on the same street, same time of day? Because the information you saw within your right brain was different than what your friend saw. In other words, you both saw different pictures of what you expected to happen next. Neither of you are aware of what you observed internally, but you're both very certain as to how you felt, safe or unsafe, when it happened. From a behaviorist point of view, the stimulus is the dog, the response is to pet it, walk back away. And behaviorism, the black box, is the unknown factor that determines or directly influences our response. However, that unknown factor between the stimulus and the response is now known to be filled with subconscious images, and those unconscious images influence our thoughts and our feelings, consequently our reactions. So simply put, the dog is the stimulus, reaction is the response, and the black box in between contains the unconscious pictures that directly influence how we think, feel, and react. Usually when we respond to a situation like a strange dog approaching, our reactions take less than a second. If it takes less than a second to react, that means your mind has to process the information even faster than that. So you don't have time to retrieve a whole memory in order to know how to react, but only an image that tells you if the situation is safe or not. And that image is a storage information form, or metaphor for short. And when we capture the image of a metaphor, when we come to know its name, we then begin to understand what's going on inside our internal machinery and begin to have power and some control over our responses. Now we know from science that there's great power in the process of naming something. For example, before scientists cure a disease, the first thing they usually do is give that ailment or syndrome a name. So too, giving a name to our internal process is the beginning of having power over it. And Viktor Frankl said between the stimulus and the response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose our freedom. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. And space is a very appropriate word to use because we want to locate the space where our information is coming from. For example, say we have an unwanted feeling of anger. We want to first locate where that feeling is. Say it's in the chest. What's it like in the chest? Like a volcano. The volcano is the metaphor. And the interesting thing about a metaphor, such as a volcano, is that it has a life of its own. We want to will it away. We don't like the uncomfortable feeling. We don't want to have a volcano. And yet it has a life of its own because it's not interested in cooling down. It's interested in spewing lava. Now, we can intervene and we can use the imagination to pour cool water over it, but that would be using the imagination, and it might work for a day or two, but it would not be a permanent solution. Instead of using the imagination, we want to directly access the subconscious mind and find an opportunity on the level of the subconscious to deconstruct these images, and that provides permanent lasting relief. When you use the imagination, it doesn't work because a metaphor, like a volcano, resides within the mind. The volcano already resided within the subconscious mind before we captured the name or saw the image of it. But it was only by slowing down the perception of time we were able to capture the image, know its name, and once we discover a way for the internal volcano to cool down on its own without our using our imagination, the accompanying temper that emanates from the volcano will cool down. The accompanying temper will automatically cool down and with much less effort to control your temper than before. An interesting side note here is that the word temperature begins with the word temper. When we first discover the name of a metaphor, this internal structure is invested in staying the way it is. A tight knot that we might want to have loosen up does not initially have an interest in loosening. It's been tight for years. The most important part of this healing process is that when the imagery in the right brain does come into focus, the pictures at the source of the problem do have the ability to change on their own. The process does not use imagination, but uses the self-regulating capability of the human mind. The human mind has a self-regulating capability. Just as the body has the ability to heal itself, so too does the human mind when given the opportunity. And when a metaphor has the opportunity to change on its own, so too do the reactions, thoughts, and feelings that stem from the metaphor. Change the root, change the reaction. In other words, change the root, which is the metaphor, change the surface, which is the thought, feeling, or reaction. And since metaphors cannot be persuaded or directed or influenced to change through the imagination or suggestion, how do they change on their own? This is accomplished through a process of questions and observations. Again, metaphors cannot be persuaded, but they can change on their own through a process of questions and observation. There's a law in physics, and there's a link here to a video that demonstrates this physical law if you want to know more. But there's a law in physics that states the very act of observation changes the phenomena being observed. Let me say that again. The very act of observation changes the phenomena being observed. There is a specific succession of questions, a step-by-step procedure for slowing down the perception of time to first capture the image, and then another series of questions that facilitates change while the metaphor is under observation. Here's an example of how changing the root changes the surface. A patient who is a dentist reported it was very hard for him to speak in front of a group of people. If he was with his wife, another couple, he was okay. But a group any larger than that, and he would just clam up. No history of abuse, trauma, neglect, nothing in the past to indicate why he would feel that way. He just felt insecure in front of people and felt that was just part of his makeup, just the way he was. So in ferreting out the metaphor for his lack of confidence in speaking up, we start with the question, when you have difficulty speaking up in a group of people, what would have to happen for you to be able to speak up more easily? To which he said, well, I guess I'd have to not feel quite so weak inside. Then the question goes, again, we had talked about space before, the importance of space. So the question was, when you don't feel quite so strong inside or you feel weak, whereabouts do you feel weak inside? And he said, I feel it mostly in my stomach. Where in your stomach? In the middle. What's it like in the middle? And when you ask what's it like, that entices the metaphor to come out. What's it like? Again, when something is like something else. So what's it like in the middle of the stomach where you feel weak or not as strong as you might like? He said soft and mushy. And again, teasing out the metaphor, what's it like? Soft and mushy like what? Like clay. Now we have the whole name of the metaphor, soft, mushy clay. Now, in asking questions of the soft, mushy clay, we have gone from a feeling of a lack of confidence to the location where the information is coming from in the middle of the stomach, and we now have the metaphor of soft, mushy clay. In effect, the left brain says, I'm not confident, I can't speak up. In the right brain, the experience or the imagery is soft, mushy clay. And that's what he'll access unconsciously when he responds or doesn't respond. Now, we could use the imagination to do something here with that clay, but that would not provide a lasting solution because the soft, mushy clay is resident within the right brain, again, having a life of its own. Again, we say resident because it was there before we named it. So the way to change a metaphor is to question it and observe it until it changes on its own. So the next series of questions were asked, does the soft, mushy clay have a color? Does it have a shape? Does it have a size? Does it have a temperature, moisture, weight, movement, texture? What kind of surface? At this point, by the seventh or eighth question, he says, I've never thought of it like this, but all of these questions are either bringing it into the light of day or the open air, but I'm seeing something change. Okay, and so when you're seeing something change, what kind of change do you see? He says, I think it's getting harder. Yes, it's definitely getting harder. So now, playing off the word harder, I ask, so as it's getting harder, and it's getting harder like that, and it's getting harder, how hard can that hard clay get when it's getting harder like that? So he said, well, it's kind of like steel. And what kind of steel could that be? He says, I don't know, but I see rivets. And what kind of rivets can you see? Like the kind you see on a battleship. And what kind of battleship could that be? Like a World War II battle cruiser. So now we've gone from soft, mushy clay to a World War II battle cruiser, and you'll notice it was not influenced. There were no suggestions as to what it should be or should become. The change was completely self-generated. The questions that initiated the observation and requested definition of the metaphor allowed the change to happen by itself. Through the act of observation, where the phenomena being observed changes on its own, just by being observed, within the subconscious mind provides an opportunity for those images being observed within the inner mind to change on their own. The change in the operational language of the subconscious mind changes the thoughts and feelings and reactions they directly influence. So by allowing the soft, mushy clay to develop on its own into a World War II battle cruiser, we can expect a change in the unwanted behavior. And sure enough, here's what happened. The patient is a dentist, and the following week he goes to a dentist convention. He comes back and he reports that he was sitting in a room in an auditorium of about 400 to 500 other dentists, and one of the speakers gets up and on the stage, and for whatever reason, the first words out of this speaker's mouth is, dentists have the highest rate of suicide. To which the patient, not barely a moment later, yells out in front of 400 or 500 people, not the good ones, brings the house down. They're laughing, they're clapping. So he reports back, he says, those words just shot out of my mouth and I didn't even stop to think about it. But when I realized how unlike me it was, I did think about where did those words come from? And I realized then they shot out of a cannon on that World War II battleship. So you see, as automatically as he would have shut up and not said anything, regardless of what he thought, when he had soft, mushy clay in his psyche, that's how automatically he responded, how automatically he shot back when the metaphor, the internal structure within the subconscious mind was changed. When we change the metaphorical roots of our thoughts, feelings, and reactions, they change, the thoughts, feelings, and reactions change automatically because that's the source of our thoughts and feelings and reactions. One of the formulas used in metaphor therapy that at first glance won't make a great deal of sense is that a persistent uncomfortable feeling in its metaphorical form can become a healing antibody within a memory, freeing up the child within and moving time forward. Now, you don't have to understand this just yet. I'll explain it so it makes sense. In the example of the dentist, we changed the uncomfortable feeling, and we did so without finding a child in the past, without going back into a frozen part in the past. Let's use an example where there was history that was abusive and traumatic. A patient said he couldn't forgive his father because of what had happened 30 years before. A victim of sexual abuse said he couldn't forgive his father, though he'd been dead for 20 years at that point. When I asked what has to happen for you to be able to forgive your father, he said, I'd have to stop being so angry at him. When I think about it, I'm still angry after all these years. In fact, I don't even want to think about it now. An interesting note to make at this point, when he says he doesn't even want to think about it, it suggests that there's a truncated memory there. A truncated memory meaning he's stuck in a moment of time. It's the memory, the event still hasn't ended. He hasn't moved through it. He's still stuck in T-1. And so it's still occurring in the back of his mind, and that's why he doesn't want to talk about it. He doesn't want to look at it because it's still painful to look at, and the reason it's still painful to look at is because he's still frozen in that moment and it's still occurring or reoccurring. In looking for the metaphor for the anger, I asked, when you can't forgive your father and you can tell that you can't forgive because you're still angry, where do you feel that anger? Again, we're looking for the space. Is it more on the inside of skin or more on the outside? We located the anger in the front of his head and his forehead. The metaphor we discovered was a hot rock, and we invited the hot rock to go back to the memory. In going back to the memory, it cooled down like a mirror. So the memory, the anger, the hot rock, in going back into the memory, cooled down on its own and became another metaphor on its own. The metaphor of a mirror went into the memory, and it went to the father's face in the memory, and the father looked at the mirror, saw his own shame, what he was doing was a shameless thing, saw his own shame, stopped what he was doing, patted the boy on the back, looked him in the eyes and said, I'm so sorry, I didn't realize what I was doing, and walked away. So what's happened here? The anger that was resident in his body as a hot rock is now outside of his physiology. The memory that was truncated because it was still going on and he had never forgotten it, the memory was finally finished. It was over. The young boy who was a victim of this no longer had to endure it, so he was freed. So when we use the formula, when we look at the formula, a persistent uncomfortable feeling, anger and unforgiveness, in its metaphorical form of a hot rock, can become a healing antibody, which was the mirror, within the memory, and it freed up the wounded child within, and as the father moved off and away, the memory was moved forward in time, freeing up the child and finishing the memory. Now that formula makes a bit more sense than it did when we first looked at it. One of the factors that create a wounded child within is when emotional needs of a child go unmet. We've been talking about abuse, trauma, neglect, but when a child's need for love, attention, safety and security are not met, and emotional hunger develops. And that emotional hunger is the basis for addiction, as very little in the environment or relationships can satisfy. Emotional hunger interferes with ability to comfort yourself when stressed or anxious. Emotional hunger fuels the need for praise and attention constantly. And even as expectation of others can become high, it's unsatisfying even when those expectations are met. One outstanding trait of emotional hunger is a void within that's unable to be satisfied. We already talked about how that void forms. But it's that very dissatisfaction, that hole in the soul, that when it's transformed into a metaphor can begin to provide the information and the direction towards resolution. When we find the metaphor for that hunger, the metaphor becomes a vehicle to reestablish self-worth, satisfaction, and fulfillment. Sometimes the hunger is a physical hunger. One patient, for example, was hungry so much of the time that she gained weight to the point where she stopped weighing herself. And once we developed her insatiable hunger as a big empty cavern, we began to examine the cavern. So left brain says I'm hungry all the time. Right brain says big empty cavern. When we looked around the big empty cavern, we slowed down the perception of time to just explore it. It was cold, it was empty, and as the more we explored it, she heard crying. Where, again, we're looking spatially, where is the crying coming from? In the back. What kind of crying in the back? A baby crying. What kind of baby crying? She's shaking and shivering like she's cold, but really she's shaking and shivering from hunger. When we found a way to feed that baby on a level that made sense to the baby crawled out of the cavern. And once the baby crawled out of the cavern immediately disappeared. And when the cavern disappeared, so did that persistent hunger. At the end of the session, she said she'd always felt like a big fat elephant, but was too embarrassed to ever say that to anyone. But at that moment, she felt like a gazelle with weights on. After that, she was able to control her eating and consequently shed all the weight she wanted to lose without further sessions. And there's a link to a before and after picture of this particular patient. Since the subconscious mind cannot tell the difference between fantasy and reality, the key to direct access to the subconscious mind is to treat figurative language as real. That is, to treat the figures within the figurative as though they exist. This becomes a direct link into the subconscious mind, as this connection brings the subconscious pictures or constructs to life. In effect, at that point, you're speaking the same language as the subconscious mind. The value in accessing subconscious imagery is that the metaphors can become healing antibodies and restore the lost parts of self. For example, as I've mentioned before, many people who've been in a car accident still see the car coming at them because they froze in that memory of time. Fortunately, we can follow the trail of uncomfortable feelings in their metaphorical form and finish the past and restore the self. This can be difficult to accomplish on a conscious cognitive level because when the self disconnected within the past, it didn't happen consciously. Dissociation is a defense mechanism that operates on the subconscious level, so that's the level where it can be healed the most rapidly. For example, a woman described leaving her body during a rape, saying she went up to the ceiling to avoid the whole thing. She dissociated rather than face the next awful moment. When asked where in the ceiling she went, she said the middle. When asked what's it like when you're up in the middle of the ceiling, she said I'm as flat as a pancake. The flat pancake is the metaphor for the dissociated self that left the body. Looking at the memory of the event didn't help, but in fact it would just re-traumatize her to discuss what happened. She didn't want to see it the first time. She certainly doesn't want to see it now. But finding the space in the ceiling where she hid and was hiding still was the beginning of her journey back to self. And once we found a way to reintegrate that flat pancake back into the psyche, the uncomfortable feelings inside originating from that split stopped. Metaphors have a tremendous capacity to transform into healing emotional antibodies. When dissociation creates uncomfortable feelings, even though this defense mechanism is designed to protect the psyche from pain, it accomplishes this at the expense of losing parts of self. That internal disconnection and the loss of self generates a void and an emotional hunger that's hard to consciously satisfy. For example, a woman facing gastric bypass surgery was told she might die without the procedure, and yet her inability to stop eating also exposed her to a very dangerous situation. If she kept eating as much as she had, she was going to die after the procedure as well. Long story made short, we found a state of confusion. Confusion brought us to a maze. The maze brought us to an 8-year-old girl leaning up against it. The history of the 8-year-old girl was when her mother married her stepfather, he molested her, and at that very moment she decided she had to grow up. There was no more room for the 8-year-old girl. And so when she decided to grow up and there was no more room for the 8-year-old girl, she buried that girl. And we found that girl buried deep within. And so we went deep within. We found the wounded child within inside. And when we found a way to reinstate that child, she lost her sweet tooth and she lost so much weight, she didn't need the gastric bypass surgery. This is an example of how very frequently we'll find a wounded child within that's attached to the metaphor we've developed. Another example was a chiropractor who was very uncomfortable telling his patients they had to come back for another appointment for fear of being seen as greedy. In essence, what stopped him from prescribing the necessary frequency of care was his fear of rejection and abandonment. Asking where he felt uncomfortable, finding the space the information was coming from, he noticed it was a vague feeling around his stomach. Developing that vague feeling into a metaphor, we found two hands squeezing. Long story made short, the two hands squeezing went back to an incubator that had no holes in it. So it was he as an infant in an incubator that mommy and daddy could not reach through and touch him. And the two hands only knew how to do one thing, and that was to squeeze. So they went back to the incubator and they squeezed and held and comforted that baby until mommy and daddy could get to him. And how long would it like to stay there? For the few days? Forever. So even though it's just a few days till mommy and daddy get there, it stays there forever. And when the two squeezing hands stayed there forever, the symptoms around his stomach disappeared, and consequently he was able to tell his patients to come in as often as he felt was needed. You see, the discomfort of not being touched in his first days of life caused the infant to dissociate so as to not feel the hunger for tactile closeness and warmth he so needed, and yet was not available at the time. Using the symptom in metaphorical form, the two hands squeezing, allowed us to go back to the time of wounding, using the metaphor as a healing antibody that comforted the baby, which finished the memory and dissolved the discomfort that held him back from doing what was needed. And you may wonder, well, wasn't that just his imagination because he was too young to know? That was just an infant. How could he possibly remember? The body remembers everything. Everything, and just as the body has healing antibodies that repair us physically, so too does the mind have emotional healing antibodies that can free the fragmented, the wounded child within, finish up the truncated memory, and move the child forward in time to reintegrate back into the adult psyche, providing the needed emotional resources. Restoring the self can reduce or dissolve the uncomfortable feelings that are the foundation of depression, anxiety, compulsions, and obsessions. If you think about it, how many unwanted behaviors like food and addiction disorders are fueled by an attempt to manage or reduce emotionally uncomfortable feelings that won't go away otherwise? When metaphor transforms fears into healing resources, when metaphors transform anger, guilt, shame, fear into healing resources that restore the self, it becomes easier to tolerate the feelings that were previously driven that had previously driven unwanted behaviors. Because as it feels safe to feel the void within, the deep needs that were denied before feel safe to come to the surface. When the emptiness is felt and no longer avoided, healing begins. Like a child who doesn't cry until he or she sees his mother, because that's when they feel safe to feel the fear or the pain, so too we will not feel the deep issues and the deep pain until we feel safe enough to feel them. Within a metaphoric conversation, we're not only looking at the issues, but we're looking at the issues from a distance for a new perspective. And it's a way to move around a problem without necessarily having to go through it. For example, the gentleman who was abused by his father would have been too painful for him to look directly at the memory. And it's interesting to note that Carl Jung said the foundation of all mental illness is the avoidance of legitimate suffering. Well, sometimes legitimate suffering is unbearable, as in the example of sexual abuse by a father. So in this instance, we found a way to see the memory from a different point of view and heal it without having to suffer the pain and agony and anguish of going through it again. In other words, using the subconscious mind, we can provide solutions and conclusions not evident before. Also, metaphoric conversations can bypass the mind's natural defense mechanisms in a safe, non-intrusive, and analgesic fashion. Analgesic meaning less painful than it would have been otherwise. The advantage to bypassing the justification and rationalizations that keep us from knowing the inner truth, bypassing justification and rationalization of the left brain by employing the right brain provides a more pristine view of what's really going on inside, and again does so in an analgesic manner. For example, when looking at the rage a woman felt over being molested by family members when she was a child, she had repressed many of these memories, and in recalling them, she began to have feelings of insanity. She felt like she was going insane. The feeling of insanity was intolerable. Looking at the metaphor began to give us distance, and in looking at the metaphor of the feelings of insanity, they were like swirling electrons. The swirling electrons brought us to the metaphor of an atom, that the swirling electrons were swirling around. The atom itself became a healing resource when we discovered that the nucleus of the atom was like an atom bomb. Inviting the atom bomb back into the memory, it went into the memory, it went to the basement where the perpetrations had occurred. Once there, the bomb exploded, and the fallout from the bomb filled the basement entirely, filled the basement where the violations had occurred. Once the basement was filled with the debris from the fallout, the memories could no longer occur there. And once the rage had a chance to be safely expressed in an explosion at a distance, that is within the memory instead of inside her mind, it was no longer confined, it was no longer contained in her body, and again, the memories could no longer occur there. Without having to look at the memories directly, we were able to find resolution and completion with much less anguish. At a distance, new perspectives can offer new solutions. By creating distance from a feeling, for example, going from the terror of the feelings of insanity and rage to a distance of seeing these feelings as an atom and then an atom bomb, gives a safe distance from the negative memories and feelings. It's a bit easier to examine something unpleasant with the protection of distance. It's a bit easier to allow the expression of rage when we're further away from the explosion. And the interesting thing is, once the therapy was finished, there were other incidences that we looked at. The ground we were looking at, long story made short, transformed into a game board. And she was able to fold the game board up into a box and put the box away into a closet and never have to open it again. So not only these, but other memories eventually were able to be put away. And the game board developed on its own. The only question we were looking at the time was how different the ground was than when we first looked at it, and the ground just transformed on its own, as do all metaphors, into this game board which could be put away forever. Interestingly, even resistance in metaphorical form provides useful information. For example, if someone says, "I can't see myself doing that," or they can't remember an incident that's repressed, having them locate and describe the space where the "I can't see" is provides useful information. The metaphor where they can't see may be that of darkness, a blank wall, a chalkboard, clouds, a blinding light. Then the metaphor of "I can't see" can be developed to provide information, movement, and inevitable resolution. Speaking of inevitability, it is inevitable that on the road to self-discovery we all come to an impasse. At times, even resistance to the very things we want. However, since resistance is also information, as such, it can be developed into a metaphor. While we mostly use our logical left brain while awake and our visual right brain while asleep, during a metaphoric conversation we are, in effect, using the left brain and the right brain at the same time. In other words, using more of your whole brain than ever before provides different perspectives on a problem as well as solutions not considered before. Archimedes once said, "Give me a long enough lever and the right place to stand, and I can move the world." With metaphor as a lever for change and the subconscious mind as the place to stand, you can move your world.